Alright guys, in this video we're going to look at another midge emerger, and this one is called the Hatching Midge. So it imitates a pretty late stage in the emerging process, and one of the big qualities of this fly is it's a little more visible, which a lot of people like tying midges. So we're using a size 16 dry fly hook. This one has a slight downturn eye, which is, I think, fine. I've never had any issue with it, but you can use a straight eye if you're so inclined. There's a couple more materials to this fly. We're going to be using CDC for the trailing shuck as well as the loop wing. We're also going to be using some grizzly hackle to wrap the thorax, and the finer the grizzly hackle, the better, especially when you're getting down size 18-20 of this fly. Also, we're going to be using some peacock curl. And for the ribbing, we're actually going to use some tying thread. I'm going to use some 6/0 uni thread tan. But use uh, whatever color variations you want to match the natural. So, to start this, we're just going to start our tying thread. I'm going to tie it to about a third of the hook shank length. And then we're going to prepare our CDC. I just peel off a decent amount of fibers for the trailing shuck. And you want about a shank length, maybe a little less than that. And I tie this CDC in. I don't start right at the eye. I start a little way down, or a little ways down the hook shank. And that's because we're going to be tying in and tying off quite a bit of stuff up around the eye. So I just want to keep it as free as we possibly can. So start this down a little ways, trim this stuff off. And we're just taking it down to the bend of the hook. I get that tied in. I'm going to just trim this up just a little. And you don't have to. I mean, it would have been fine the way it was. It's just one of my worst qualities fly tying. I always feel like I've got to be trimming and clipping, but it would be fine. So now, if I can get this thread, we're going to just tie in the thread back here at the bend. And then tie back up to about a third of the way from the eye of the hook. Excuse me. And then just like any ribbing, we're just going to do some nice even wraps to form the abdomen. And tie that off. Alright. So now that we have that done, we're going to tie in our next three materials that we're going to need to form the abdomen, which is going to be our grizzly hackle, CDC, and peacock curl. So I tie in the hackle first, and I trim some of the fibers away from the stem just to make it a little easier to tie in. And I actually tied in a little too much stem. We definitely want to clip that away. So once we have our grizzly hackle tied in, now we can grab our CDC. And again, I like to just peel, the fibers away from the stem, especially tying smaller flies. I just think it's a little easier to craft and work with to get exactly the amount of CDC that I want. So we'll tie that in just on top of the hook shank. and then trim this excess off the front. And that's what's going to form the loop wing on this emerger. So now we're going to tie in some peacock herl. I'm only using one strand for this size of fly. It would probably be best to use two, but when you're getting down to 18, 20, one strand's fine. And you do need to be a little careful with peacock herl. It's pretty brittle stuff, and it's annoying to get halfway through your wraps and have it break off. So just be gentle with it as you wrap up. And again, I stop a little bit before the eye. I just want enough room to form a good head and not have any bulk up there, especially while you're on the river trying to tie these small flies on. So once we have peacock herl tied off, we're just gonna wrap this grizzly hackle. And I didn't do it on this fly, but I usually like to kind of fray out the fibers from the stem before I start tying. I just think it helps it go on a little more evenly. And you can just do a few wraps. The more wraps, especially when it's a finer fiber like this grizzly hackle, the more wraps you do, the little better it's going to ride on top of the water. The more densely you wrap the hackle. If you go a little sparingly, it's not going to float as well. So now we're just going to pull the CDC up over the body and then kind of push back on it, the hook out from the little loop, and just do some loose wraps. Make sure the loop's positioned where we want it. And you can leave that stuff on the back if you want. It's not going to make or break catching the fish. Trim up this stem a little bit because I do want it to kind of ride flat on the surface of the water rather than kind of dip into it. So I trimmed that CDC post. Do a little whip finish, and yeah, make sure you don't, tie that post down where it's going beneath the eye hook or the eyelet of the hook. Do our whip finish, cut the thread, and there you go, a hatching midge. And again, I like to keep that hackle not too far below the hook gap. But this is, like I said, it imitates kind of a midge in that those last stages of emergence before they form an adult. This rides on the water well with the CDC and the finer grizzly hackle. So it makes it a little bit easier. It makes it a little more visible with this material, which a lot of people will like with midges. And this is size 16. I usually tie these size 18, size 20, and I usually don't go much smaller than that, but you can. Let's tie one more. Sorry, I didn't have my CDC ready to go. So we're doing about a shank length. Tie that in. And another thing I like about this fly is while it's an emerger pattern, if I see fish that seem to be, feeding on adults, like I will still tie this fly on. I think it imitates an adult pretty well. Um, so it's kind of a all-around fly. You know, fish are feeding a merger, uh, or adult, or a little of both. This is a good pattern to have on the water. And a thread. And there's a lot of variations you can do with this fly as well. You know, the shuck material, and even some dubbing instead of the peacock curl, or different type of ribbing. Uh, there's a lot you can change on this fly to get it the way you want it. You just do a little experimenting, but the pattern itself, the basics of the pattern, I think are a really good starting point for a midge emerger. And I like fishing this if I'm on a little faster water, uh, just because of the visibility versus smaller uh, patterns that may sit you know within the uh, uh, surface of the water, right in that surface film. That can be tough to see, but this one sits a little more on top and makes it a little easier. If you're not fishing still water. Tired grizzly hackle in. Yeah, and you don't have to use grizzly hackle either. And you can see here where I've kind of flayed those fibers out from the stem a little bit. You can use fine hackle of any color to better match what's hatching at the time. But you do need to make sure that you're using the finer rooster saddle versus hen, because you're not going to get the floating properties. If you don't want the floating properties, that's all right, I guess. But yeah, I mean, uh, midge emergers are definitely something you want in your fly box on the river. I know we're on our home waters. My buddy lovingly refers to midge hatches as trash hatches, uh, and a lot of people probably feel that way. They're a bit more technical to fish, uh, but with the right patterns, um, you can still have a lot of success during these hatches. Because while a lot of people might not care for them, the fish definitely love them. So again, be careful with the peacock curl. It is brittle stuff. But this fly is really good if you have that kind of feeling towards midges, just because it rides a little higher. Excuse me, and it's a little easier to see. And once you get some confidence fishing midge hatches, you can really move down into the smaller flies that might imitate naturals a bit more closely. And that's nothing against this fly. I mean, it imitates it just fine. Let's wrap this hackle. Because I kind of mentioned its versatility, I think it imitates a lot of stuff. Uh, an emerging midge, with the loop wing, it gets uh, that good kind of sparkly gas bubble appearance emergers have. Uh, and then with the hackle and just the way this body's formed, I think it imitates uh, adults just as well, and kind of cluster patterns that you'll see with a lot of adults. So be careful when you, like I just did, tying off that hackle. You don't want to catch a lot of that grizzly hackle and give it a odd angle. You want it, you know, vertical. We'll form this loop wing. And you can also experiment a lot with the loop wing, just in terms of how much CDC you want on it. Because more CDC obviously makes it a little more bulky, but you also get a lot better float to underneath that post. I'll trim that down. Again, I can't help myself. Kind of make sure that eye is clear. There's nothing more annoying than getting on the river and realizing you were sloppy on the bench. Whip finish this again, try and not catch any of those hackle fibers. And there's another Hatching Midge. Great versatile pattern. Um, Imitates quite a few different stages of the midge life cycle. And, it can fish a lot of different waters. It's a little more visible. It's just an all-around good midge pattern that you should have in your box. So check out our other emerger patterns, our other pupa patterns, and we also are going to have some adult patterns coming your way soon.